The dust of the West Texas plains settled like a fine, golden shroud over everything Silas Black owned. It coated the rails of his fences, the brim of his hat, and the very lines etched around his eyes. For 30 years, this dust had been his partner, a silent witness to a life lived in rhythm with the sun and the seasons. And in that life, there was no creature he understood better or respected more than Aries. The bull was a living mountain of muscle and midnight fur, a champion bred from a line of champions. But to Silas, he was more than pedigree. He was a presence, a quiet covenant between man and nature. That afternoon, however, the covenant was about to be broken. The air, usually thick with the sweet smell of hay and warm earth, grew heavy, charged with an invisible current. Silas saw it in the twitch of the bull's massive shoulders, the wild white rim of his eye. Something was wrong. For a heart-stopping moment, the seasoned cowboy, a man who could read the soul of an animal in a glance, stood face to face with a stranger. This wasn't Aries. This was 1,000 pounds of pure, unbridled fury. He was gored before he even understood the betrayal. What happened in that dusty pen, a place of trust turned into a theater of violence, was only the beginning. The real story, the unbelievable part, began not with an act of revenge, but with a question that would change everything. The world dissolved into a storm of raw sensation. First, the sound, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the very core of the earth, a sound Silas had heard 1,000 times before but never aimed at him. It was the sound of a gathering storm, a promise of power about to be unleashed. Then, the sight. Aries, his head lowered, the magnificent curve of his horns that Silas had so often admired now looking like polished daggers aimed at his own heart. The dust swirled around the bull's hooves as he pawed the ground, not in a ritual of dominance, but with a frantic, desperate energy. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing in the same terrifying breath. Silas's mind, honed by decades of instinct, raced through a checklist of possibilities. A snake? A sudden injury? A scent on the wind that spooked him? But there was nothing. Just the flat, unforgiving Texas sun beating down on them both. He raised a hand, a gesture of peace, his voice a low and steady murmur. "Easy, boy. Easy now." The words were a prayer, swallowed by the rising tide of the bull's agitation. The charge, when it came, was not a fluid motion of athletic grace. It was a convulsion, a violent, explosive rejection of the world around him. Silas had no time to move, only to turn his body, a futile instinct to protect his core. The impact was a brutal, physical shockwave. It felt less like a piercing and more like being struck by a falling tree, a crushing, splintering force that stole his breath and sent him airborne. He landed with a sickening thud, the world a kaleidoscope of spinning blue sky and brown earth. The pain was a white-hot fire, a searing line drawn across his side and thigh, but it was secondary to the profound, aching shock of betrayal. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his vision swimming. Aries stood over him, not triumphant, but trembling, his massive chest heaving, his nostrils flared, and a string of saliva swung from his jaw. And in that moment, through the haze of agony, Silas saw it. Not malice, not murder. In the dark, deep pools of the bull's eyes, he saw a reflection of his own shock, magnified 100 times over. It was pure, unadulterated terror. The bull wasn't a killer. He was a victim of a fear so profound it had turned him into a weapon against the one person he trusted. Then, the world went dark. The antiseptic white of the hospital room was an alien landscape to Silas. The steady, rhythmic beep of the monitor beside his bed was a sterile imitation of a heartbeat, a world away from the living, breathing pulse of his ranch. His side was a landscape of its own, a stitched and bandaged territory of deep, throbbing pain. Every breath was a negotiation, but the physical torment was a dull echo compared to the storm raging in his mind. His neighbor, a grizzled rancher named Hank, had driven him to the emergency room, his face a mask of grim concern. The story had already begun to travel on the wind, passed from one ranch to another. Silas Black's bull turned on him. The words carried an unspoken sentence. A bull that attacks its owner is a broken animal, a liability, a ghost you put down before it can haunt anyone else. Dr. Evans, the local large animal vet, came to visit on the second day. She was a practical woman, with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor that Silas had always respected. She sat by his bed, her hands folded in her lap, and got straight to the point. "Silas, we need to talk about Aries." He knew what was coming. He could hear the weight of her professional opinion before she even spoke it. "He's a danger," she said softly, but with an edge of finality. "Once a bull shows that level of aggression, that unpredictability, you can't trust him again. You know the protocol. It's for your safety. For everyone's safety." Hank, who had come along with her, nodded in solemn agreement. "She's right, Si. It's a damn shame, a bull like that. But he crossed a line. You can't have a time bomb that big walking around your property. You got lucky this time. Next time," he left the sentence hanging in the sterile air, a chilling premonition. It was the logical choice. The sane choice. Every instinct of self-preservation, every piece of hard-won cowboy wisdom screamed the same verdict. The story of Silas and Aries had to end with a gunshot. It was a mercy, they called it, a sad necessity. But as Silas lay there, listening to their sensible, rational arguments, his mind kept drifting back to the dust of the pen, to the final image before he lost consciousness. He didn't see a monster. He saw a terrified child trapped in the body of a behemoth. And a question began to form, a tiny seed of defiance in the barren ground of his pain. What if everyone was wrong? Days bled into one another, marked not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the nurse's rounds and the changing of his bandages. The chorus of well-meaning advice continued, a steady drumbeat of "put him down, it's the only way, don't be a fool." They saw the situation in stark black and white. A good man and a bad bull. A victim and an aggressor. But for Silas, the world had become a place of infinite, agonizing gray. He would close his eyes, and the scene would replay itself, a grainy, silent film projected onto the back of his eyelids. The lowered head, the pawing hoof, the explosive charge. But with each viewing, his focus shifted. He pushed past the blinding flash of his own pain and fear, forcing himself to look closer, to see what he had missed. He became an investigator of his own trauma. What was the sun doing in that moment? Was there a shadow that fell in a peculiar way? A sound he had dismissed? His mind, free from the immediate demands of ranch work, began to sift through the archives of his memory. He remembered the glint. Just before Aries charged, the afternoon sun had caught something metallic on the road that ran alongside the pasture. A flicker of blinding light, probably from the chrome bumper of a passing truck. And at the same time, the faint but distinct backfire of an old engine. A sudden flash, a sharp bang. To a human it was a minor, fleeting annoyance. But to an animal, with the heightened senses of a prey creature, an animal whose entire lineage was built on reacting to sudden threats, what would that feel like? Silas began to build a new story in his mind. A story not of betrayal, but of a catastrophic misunderstanding. A story of a gentle giant pushed past his breaking point by a perfect storm of sensory overload. He envisioned the world from Aries' perspective, the sudden blinding light in his sensitive eyes, the gunshot-like crack in his ears. In that split second, Silas, the figure of safety and calm, might have been transformed in the bull's terrified mind into the source of the threat. The charge wasn't an attack on his master. It was a desperate, panicked flight towards the perceived danger, an attempt to confront the terrifying thing that had just assaulted his senses. A flicker of light. A loud noise. A terrible, tragic accident. It was a fragile theory, a whisper against the roaring wind of conventional wisdom. But it was the only theory that honored the years of trust that had come before that one terrible minute. The question was no longer what happened, but why. And in that quiet, profound shift of perspective, revenge died, and a strange, fragile hope began to take root. The day he left the hospital, Silas felt like a stranger in his own body. He moved with a stiff, careful deliberation, his side a constant, burning reminder of his new fragility. Hank drove him home, the silence in the truck thick with unspoken words. As they pulled up the long gravel driveway, Silas's eyes immediately went to the far pasture, to the holding pen where Aries was being kept in isolation. A prison, for his own safety and the bulls. "You want me to call Evans for you?" Hank asked, his voice gentle. "We can get it over with quick." "You don't have to be there." Silas looked at his friend, a man he'd known his whole life, and saw the genuine concern in his eyes. He appreciated it. But it was a concern rooted in a reality he was no longer sure he accepted. "Not yet," Silas said, his voice raspy. "I need some time." The first thing he did, after slowly making his way inside his small, quiet house, was not to rest. He walked back out, every step a sharp protest from his healing muscles, and headed for the pen. He didn't take a rope or a prod, he just took himself. The fence was made of thick, steel posts and heavy-gauge wire, a barrier built to contain 1,000 pounds of agitated bull. Today, it felt like the wall between two worlds. Aries was at the far end of the enclosure, his back to the house. When he heard Silas's slow shuffling steps, his massive head whipped around, his body went rigid, his tail stiffened. The wildness was back in his eyes, a look of defensive fear. He let out a low, warning snort. The old Silas, the uninjured Silas, might have felt a flicker of anger, a surge of pride demanding the animal show respect. But the man standing there now was someone different. He was a wounded healer, and he saw not a threat, but a reflection of his own pain. He saw an animal trapped in a memory, just like he was. Silas stopped a good 10 feet from the fence. He didn't try to get closer. He simply leaned his good side against a sturdy wooden post, letting out a long, slow sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the past week, and he just stood there. He didn't speak, he didn't move, he just shared the same patch of Texas sun with the creature that had nearly killed him. For an hour they remained in this silent tableau, man and bull, separated by a fence that represented so much more than steel. It was a fence of fear, of misunderstanding, of pain. Aries watched him, every muscle coiled and ready to spring. Silas simply watched back, his gaze calm, his heart filled not with judgment, but with a profound and aching empathy. This was the first step, not a step of conquest, but of surrender. A surrender to the idea that healing would not come from force, but from patience, from stillness, from a quiet refusal to accept the story everyone else believed to be true. Thus began the ritual. Every morning, just after dawn, and every evening, as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, Silas would make the slow, painful pilgrimage to the fence. He would bring a battered old stool and set it down, settling in for his vigil. At first, Aries remained hostile. He would pace the perimeter of the pen, snorting and tossing his head, keeping as much distance as the enclosure would allow. He was a prisoner of his own anxiety, and Silas was the warden he didn't understand. But Silas was unmovable. He brought a thermos of coffee in the mornings, and just sat, sometimes for hours. He began to talk, not to command, but to converse. He spoke in a low, even tone, the same voice he used when calming a newborn calf. He didn't talk about the attack. He talked about the weather, about the price of feed, about a memory of Aries as a young steer, chasing grasshoppers in the high pasture. He narrated the quiet, simple life of the ranch, weaving a tapestry of familiar sounds and words around the bull. "The creek's running a little high today, boy," he'd murmur, his voice a soft rumble. "Rain's coming. I can feel it in my bones. Remember how you loved the smell of the earth after a good rain?" He was reintroducing himself, not as a master, but as a feature of the landscape, as constant and harmless as the old oak tree on the hill. He was rebuilding a world for Aries that had been shattered by a moment of terror. He was using his voice to paint over the memory of the bang and the flash. Days turned into a week, then two. The change, when it started, was almost imperceptible, a subtle softening. One day, Ares stopped his frantic pacing and just stood, listening. His ears, which had been pinned back in aggression, swiveled forward, catching Silas's words. A few days later, his tail, which had been held as stiff as a rod, gave a slow, relaxed switch. The snorting became less frequent, replaced by long, deep breaths. Silas started bringing treats: an apple, sliced carefully with his pocket knife, or a handful of sweet grain. He wouldn't offer it. He would simply place it on the ground just inside the fence and retreat to his stool. For a week, the offerings went untouched. Then, one evening, under the soft, forgiving light of dusk, Ares took a hesitant step forward. Then, another. He stretched his massive neck, his wet nose twitching, and delicately lipped the apple slices from the dust. He chewed slowly, his big, dark eyes fixed on Silas. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a question, a flicker of curiosity, a tiny crack in the wall of fear. Silas felt a lump form in his throat. This was a language far older than words. It was the language of patience, of consistency, of showing up. It was the slow, painstaking work of teaching a terrified soul that it was safe to trust again. The fence between them still stood, but for the first time it felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge under construction. The moment of truth arrived on a Sunday, a month after the attack. Silas's side was still tender, a dull ache that he had learned to live with, but his strength had mostly returned. He had slept on the decision, turning it over and over in his mind. The ritual at the fence had become a new kind of normal. Ares no longer met him with hostility, but with a quiet anticipation. He would be waiting by the gate in the mornings, and would often rest his great head near the rails as Silas spoke. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, calm watchfulness. Today, Silas did not bring his stool. He walked to the gate of the holding pen, his heart a heavy drum against his ribs. He unlatched it, the metallic click echoing in the morning stillness. He didn't swing the gate wide open. He just opened it a foot, creating a narrow gap, an invitation rather than a command. Then, he did the bravest thing he had ever done in a lifetime of brave things. He turned his back on the bull, walked 10 paces into the center of the pen, and sat down in the dust. He was making himself completely vulnerable. He was offering the ultimate gesture of trust, placing his life, his fragile, healing body, back into the hands of the animal that had so nearly taken it. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas could hear his own blood pulsing in his ears. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, resisting the overwhelming urge to look back. He was giving Ares a choice, free from coercion or dominance. He could charge again. He could flee through the open gate. Or he could do something else entirely. Have you ever placed your fate completely in the hands of another? Have you ever had to trust someone who had broken you, believing that the person they were was more than the worst thing they had ever done? For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then Silas heard it. The soft, heavy scuff of a hoof in the dirt. One step, then a pause, then another. The sound was slow, deliberate, inquisitive. He felt a shadow fall over him, as the bull's immense form blocked the sun. He held his breath. A hot, grassy puff of air washed over the back of his neck as Ares sniffed him. Silas remained perfectly still. And then, he felt a pressure, a solid, heavy weight against his shoulder blade. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't a threat. It was a lean, a deliberate, gentle press of contact. Slowly, tentatively, Silas lifted a hand, not looking, and placed it on the bull's massive cheek. The fur was coarse and warm. Ares didn't flinch. Instead, he pushed into the touch, letting out a low, soft rumble from deep within his chest. It wasn't the sound of a gathering storm. It was the sound of a settled peace. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Silas's cheek and dripped onto the ground between them. The fence was gone. The wall had crumbled. The man and the bull were whole again. The weeks that followed were a quiet renaissance. The story of Ares's survival and Silas's strange methods had become local legend, met with a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and outright scorn. "You're training a loaded gun, Silas," Hank had warned him, shaking his head. Don't be surprised when it goes off again. But Silas was no longer listening to the voices outside his fence line. He was listening to the silent language he now shared with Aries. Their bond, reforged in the fires of trauma and forgiveness, was stronger than it had ever been. It was something new, something deeper. It was during one of their long, rambling walks across the pasture, Aries now following Silas with the gentle loyalty of a sheepdog, that the idea first sparked. Local rodeos were a cornerstone of their community, a celebration of the skills and partnership between rider and animal. But it was a world often built on dominance, on a contest of wills. What if, Silas thought, they could show them something different? What if they could enter the arena not as adversaries to be conquered, but as partners in a dance? The idea seemed absurd. Taking the killer bull into a crowded, noisy arena filled with triggers was the definition of foolishness. But Silas saw it as the ultimate testament to their journey. It wouldn't be about winning a prize buckle. It would be about showing the world that forgiveness was more powerful than fear. He started a new kind of training. There was no force, no intimidation. It was an extension of the patience he'd shown at the fence line. He worked with Aries on responding to the quietest of cues, a shift in his weight, a soft click of his tongue, the barest touch on his neck. He simulated the noise of a crowd by playing a radio near the barn, gradually increasing the volume over days. He got his neighbors' kids to run and shout near the pasture, getting Aries accustomed to unpredictable sights and sounds. Their practice sessions were a sight to behold. A fluid, intricate ballet between a weathered cowboy and a one-ton bull. They moved as one, a seamless union of intention and response. Where other handlers used prods and loud commands, Silas used whispers and trust. He was teaching Aries not to obey, but to participate. He was asking for the bull's intelligence, not just his compliance. The skepticism from his peers was a constant headwind. They saw his methods as soft, his goal as suicidal. But Silas was resolute. This wasn't for them. This was for him and Aries. It was the final chapter in their story of redemption, a public declaration that the deepest wounds can be healed, and that the most feared monsters are often just misunderstood souls waiting for a second chance. The day of the Denton County Rodeo arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, threatening rain that never came. The air was electric with the smell of popcorn, livestock, and nervous energy. As Silas backed the trailer carrying Aries into its designated spot, he could feel the stares. Cowboys paused their conversations, their eyes lingering on the massive black bull, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Whispers followed them like a shadow. "That's the one," they'd say. "The one that nearly killed Black." Silas ignored them, his focus entirely on his partner. He spoke to Aries in a low, calming murmur as he led him from the trailer, his hand resting on the bull's powerful neck. In the warm-up pen, away from the main arena, the contrast was stark. Other teams were a flurry of tense energy, riders shouting, animals skittish and agitated. Silas and Aries were an island of calm in the storm. Silas simply stood with the bull, scratching his favorite spot behind the ears, their breathing synchronized and slow. When their turn came, the announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, crackling with manufactured excitement. "And now, folks, a local legend you may have heard about. Silas Black and his bull, Aries." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. The announcer, sensing the drama, leaned into it. "Some of you know the story here. This very bull put Silas in the hospital not 6 months ago. Some call him crazy, some call him brave. But tonight he's here to prove that man and beast can overcome anything." Silas winced. He hadn't wanted the spectacle, the cheap drama. He had only wanted to show the truth. He gave Aries one last, reassuring pat. "Just you and me, boy," he whispered. "Just a walk in our own pasture." He gave the cue, a soft click of his tongue, and together they entered the arena. The roar of the crowd was a physical wave of sound. The bright lights seemed to suck the air from the space. For a split second, Silas felt Aries tense beneath his hand, a tremor of the old fear. Silas didn't pull or force him. He just stood still, letting his own calm travel through his hand into the bull's body. He waited. After a moment, Ares let out a long breath and took a confident step forward. The performance they gave left the crowd in stunned silence. It wasn't about speed or aggression. It was about precision, trust, and a kind of grace no one had ever seen from an animal so powerful. Ares navigated the obstacles with the delicacy of a dancer, responding to Silas's nearly invisible cues. He moved with a fluid, willing intelligence, his massive form a study in controlled power. The silence in the arena slowly transformed. It became a silence not of fear, but of awe. The spectacle they were witnessing wasn't a man dominating a beast. It was a partnership, a conversation, a miracle of trust played out under the bright lights. When they finished their run, the silence held for a beat, and then erupted into a roar of applause that was unlike anything Silas had ever heard. It wasn't just for a good score, it was for the story they had just told without a single word. They won. The judges, captivated by the unique display of harmony and skill, awarded them the highest score of the night. Hank was the first to reach him as he exited the arena, his face a picture of stunned disbelief. He didn't say "I was wrong." He just clapped Silas on the shoulder, his eyes wet with emotion, and said, "I'll be damned, Si. I'll be damned." Other cowboys, men who had whispered behind his back, came forward to shake his hand, their expressions full of a newfound respect. They didn't just see a winning bull, they saw a master horseman, a man who understood the very soul of an animal. The prize was a large, ornate silver buckle and a check that would cover feed costs for a year. Silas accepted them with a gracious nod, the cheers of the crowd washing over him. But his eyes weren't on the prize or the people. His eyes were on Ares, who stood calmly beside him, occasionally nudging his hand for a scratch. The real victory wasn't this moment of public validation. The real victory had happened months ago, in the quiet dust of an empty pen, when a man chose empathy over anger. It had happened with every apple offered, every soft word spoken to an empty pasture, every hour spent sitting by a fence. It had happened the moment a bull leaned his heavy head against the shoulder of the man he had hurt, a silent apology, offered and accepted. Later that night, long after the crowds had gone home and the rodeo grounds had fallen silent, Silas stood with Ares in their own pasture, under a vast, star-dusted sky. The silver buckle sat on the dashboard of his truck, already forgotten. He didn't need a trophy to remind him of what they had accomplished. He leaned his forehead against Ares's broad, warm side, the same spot where the bull had leaned against him in the pen. The great beast let out a soft, contented sigh. The scar on Silas's side still ached sometimes, a faint, ghostly reminder of the day the world had broken. But it was no longer a symbol of betrayal. It was a mark of transformation. It was proof that the deepest wounds don't always leave us weaker. Sometimes, they carve out a space inside us for a greater capacity to understand, to forgive, and to love. Forgiveness hadn't just saved a bull from a premature end. It had redeemed a man from the prison of his own anger. It had taken two broken souls and built something stronger, something more beautiful than what had existed before. And in the quiet peace of the Texas night, that was a prize worth more than all the silver buckles in the world.